The smoke that started a war. There was smoke rising from the grills, laughter in the air, and kids chasing each other around the horse stables when everything changed. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend. No clients, no deadlines. Just a wide-open sky and the aroma of slow-cooked brisket drifting through my family's ranch, something we did twice a year without fail. But this time, someone decided that my joy was a violation, that my name's Tyler Grant, and I own 45 acres of Texas Hill Country, a ranch passed down from my grandfather, then my father, and now it's mine. The place is a piece of freedom, with rolling hills, natural springs, and more stars than you can count at night. And the best part, it's private property, no neighbors on my land, no shared fences, no prying eyes. Or so I thought, a year ago. The community next door built a subdivision, high-end homes with fake stone walls, pristine driveways, and a homeowners association so strict they once fined a resident for parking a truck too rugged in front of their house. People around here call them the Pebblebrooks, but I call them what they are, the pretenders. And on this Saturday, during my famous biannual brisket and beer cookout, they declared war. I had just finished brushing down my horses, my boots still covered in dry hay, when I noticed 3 SUVs slowly rolling down my dirt road. They weren't neighbors. My guests had already arrived. I recognized the logo on the side of the lead vehicle, Pebblebrook HOA Enforcement. That was a laugh. A neighborhood security patrol trying to strut like they were state troopers. The woman who stepped out of the first car was exactly who I expected, Marla Henderson, president of the HOA, 50-something, power-walking posture, armed with a clipboard, and the kind of oversized sunglasses that screamed, "I command meetings like I command traffic." She didn't bother with a hello. She marched up my driveway, bypassing the grill station, ignoring the guests, and zeroed in on me like a heat-seeking missile. "Mr. Grant," she snapped, waving her clipboard, "we've had several complaints about this event." I blinked, then smiled. "What event?" "This party, this fire hazard," she spat. "Smoke drifting into our neighborhood. Loud music. Alcohol. There are children in Pebblebrook." I chuckled. "I'm on my own land, Marla. I'm not part of your HOA. Your rules don't apply to me. That may be, but your smoke does. We have our quality regulations. This grilling, it's creating a disturbance." That's when I knew it wasn't about rules. It was about control. Marla didn't like seeing people happy unless she was the one permitting it. And the fact that we were outside her jurisdiction happy, laughing, drinking must have burned her more than the BBQ smoke. I could have ignored her. Should have. But then she crossed the line. Monday morning, I got the notice. A letter from the county's zoning board. An emergency complaint had been filed against me. Marla had claimed I was operating a commercial event on agricultural land. Her report included photos of people drinking, a live band which was just my cousin with a guitar, and even a claim that I had endangered wildlife by allowing drones over protected trees. It was laughable, but the county had to investigate. That's when the real circus started. For the next week, I had to deal with inspectors, calls from the sheriff's office, and even a visit from a fire marshal, all because one woman hated the idea that she couldn't regulate what I did on my own property, and it didn't stop there. My mailbox was torn out. Guests from my cookout began receiving anonymous letters threatening lawsuits. One neighbor, a sweet retired teacher, said her HOA dues had been doubled after she was seen hugging me at the party. Marla wasn't just attacking me, she was punishing anyone connected to me. That's when I decided, if she wanted a war, I'd give her one, but not with yelling or petty complaints. No. I'd use the one thing Marla Henderson respected, property law. The planet started with coffee and silence. I sat with my lawyer, Mark, who'd been helping my family with land issues since I was a teenager. I told him everything, every threat, every fake report, every HOA stunt. I even played him voicemails from one of Marla's board members trying to blackmail a guest. He sipped his coffee slowly and said, "You know what they say about HOA letters. The only thing they care more about than rules is image. But you don't just want them embarrassed, do you?" "No," I said. "I want them neutralized." He leaned back. "Then we go bigger." That's when he pulled out a map of Pebblebrook, the community park, one of the only green spaces in their suburban maze. was not actually owned by the HOA. It was owned by a private trust that leased it to Pebblebrook for $1 a year. The lease was up for renewal. Next month, Mark made some calls discreetly. 3 days later, the trust agreed to sell to me. I had the deed by Friday. The beginning of the envy. The next HOA meeting, I owned the land they used for family gatherings, yoga classes, and their precious ottoman. The park wine tasting event. A park with no official signage, no dedicated access roads, and according to the county, no easement rights across my bordering fence line. That, in other words, they were trespassing every time they used it. And on Saturday morning, I made it official. A brand new gate, a private property no trespassing sign, and a formal notice delivered to Marla herself, effective immediately. Pebblebrook was banned from accessing the park. Marla was livid. She called, emailed, even showed up at my gate demanding I come to my senses. But I wasn't angry anymore. I was methodical. You wanted to regulate my smoke, I told her. So now, I regulate your sunlight. The neighborhood that turned on itself the first days after I locked down the park were strangely quiet. Not in a peaceful way, but the kind of silence that warns you a storm's gathering just beyond the tree line. I expected immediate retaliation from Marla and her board of HOA enforcers. But for 72 hours, there was nothing. No emails, no calls, no whole letters dropped anonymously at my gate. Just stillness, almost as if she was retreating. I wasn't fooled. Marla Henderson didn't retreat. She regrouped. I found out later that during those 3 days, Pebblebrook held an emergency HOA meeting, off schedule, unannounced. Too many residents. Only board members, a few inner circle loyalists, and their newly hired HOA attorney attended. The subject, restoration of access to community land and the handling of unauthorized ownership. In other words, how to wrest back control of a park they no longer legally owned. Meanwhile, on my side of the fence, life had never been calmer. I could finally take a breath. My inbox wasn't filled with fines or veiled threats. My dog stopped barking at every car creeping down the trail, and for the first time since this nonsense began, I sat on my porch one evening and listened to crickets instead of HOA patrol radios. But I knew better than to enjoy it too long. When I woke up Thursday morning, everything changed again. My phone buzzed nonstop. Local rancher groups I was part of started texting, linking me to a Pebblebrook neighborhood forum, screenshots, videos, angry posts. A new HOA memo had been issued at dawn. Marla had pulled her most aggressive move yet, and it didn't just target me. It punished everyone in her neighborhood. The memo stated, effective immediately, any resident caught in communication, visitation, or collaboration with Tyler Grant or any associate of his ranch would be fined $1,500 and barred from HOA services for 60 days. That included pool access, gym privileges, landscaping, trash collection, even event participation. They framed it as community cohesion preservation, but it was clear what it really was, a social exile decree. Pebblebrook had just become a dictatorship, and Marla crowned herself queen. Families who had come to my BBQ, folks who had grown up around these hills before the subdivision even existed, were now being blackmailed into silence. And it wasn't just symbolic. One man, Daniel Rhodes, a father of 3 who taught guitar at the local middle school, was seen having a coffee with me at the Feed Barn Cafe. Within hours, his HOA account was locked. His garbage service skipped him that week. His kids' swim passes were voided at the gate. It was insane. My ranch hands started reporting strange cars parked near our fences, watching us. One of my contractors received a call from a blocked number warning him he'd lose future jobs if he kept working for me. Marla was escalating from rules and letters to straight-up intimidation. But the thing about bullies is they always go one step too far, and she did by targeting an 87-year-old woman named Miss Ellie Monroe. Miss Ellie had lived in these parts since the 50s. Her husband had been my grandfather's best friend. She was family, even if we didn't share blood. She baked biscuits that could stop wars and told stories that could shame history books. When she heard about what happened at the BBQ, she showed up the next day with her signature pecan pie and 2 jars of peach preserves, just to make sure I was doing okay. That simple act of kindness cost her dearly. The HOA fined her, froze her HOA privileges, and sent her a threatening letter suggesting she was a disruptive element inciting discontent among the residents. Disruptive. At 87, all because she brought pie to an old friend. It was the final straw for many. Within 24 hours, over a dozen Pebblebrook residents contacted me in secret. Some were furious, others terrified, but all were fed up. They didn't want to be part of an authoritarian playground anymore. One woman even asked if I had space on my ranch to build a cabin she wanted out. The most surprising call came from Kevin Sullivan, the HOA's former treasurer, who had resigned 3 months earlier over creative disagreements with Marla. Turns out, he had more than disagreements, he had evidence. Kevin arrived that Friday afternoon with a flash drive and a stack of manila folders. I kept backups, he said, because one day I knew she'd go too far. Inside were years' worth of internal HOA emails, financial records, private complaints, secret disciplinary memos, and even audio recordings. What it all revealed was more than corruption. It showed a pattern of targeted retaliation, misuse of funds, and deliberate property manipulation against people who disagreed with the board. We had the ammunition now, but the question was, how would we use it? The rise of the Resistance night. I gathered a group of trusted folks in my barn, about 20 of us Pebblebrook residents. Nearby ranchers, former HOA members met quietly away from drone cams, and HOA watchers. We laid out Kevin's evidence. We brainstormed options, and we realized something important. The HOA was powerful, yes, but it was also vulnerable. Because at its core, and HOA depends on people being afraid or indifferent. Remove that fear, expose the rot, and it collapses. We split tasks. One group would handle media leak selected documents and audio clips to local news and HOA watchdog websites. Another group would prepare formal complaints to the county, the Real Estate Licensing Board, and the Zoning Commission. I would go one step further. Remember that park I bought? That wasn't the only thing I was eyeing. Turns out, the Pebblebrook HOA was late on several maintenance payments for their artificial lake system, a decorative pond that their high-end homes were built around. That system included underground pumps, filters, and a separate water treatment unit. And guess who owned the land that held the buried power supply lines to that unit? Me. I'd never cared before. It was old ranch land that wasn't good for cattle and had gone unused for years. But now, it was strategic territory. I filed a formal revocation of underground access rights, citing unsafe utility use and unauthorized routing. It was perfectly legal, and just like that, Pebblebrook's lake was about to dry up right before their biggest summer gala. By Sunday, the battle lines were drawn. Local media had picked up the story. HOA sanctions elderly resident for baking pie amid property feud. The audio of Marla berating a board member for not punishing the sympathizers fast enough went viral. Pebblebrook's name was now being dragged through HOA Reddit threads, Facebook whistleblower groups, even real estate forums where agents discussed whether to avoid showing homes in the subdivision. But Marla still wouldn't give up. She called an emergency press conference, an event she described as a community clarification gathering. She stood at the blocked gate of the now private park I owned and tried to spin it all as a misunderstanding. She blamed internet misinformation, fake documents, and disgruntled ex-members. She tried to play victim, tried to reclaim control. It would have worked if I hadn't timed my next move just right. During her speech, right as she spoke of open community values, a loud roar echoed across the park. It came from the east edge of my land, where 5 bulldozers were now clearing the field adjacent to the Pebblebrook walking path. A large banner hung from one of the tractors, Freedom Field, coming soon, open to all, except Pebblebrook. I had officially filed to build a public green space, picnic zones, food trucks, even a tiny rodeo arena, open to anyone except those under contract with the Pebblebrook HOA. Legal, yes, spiteful, perhaps, but poetic, absolutely. As the crowd around Marla's press event turned to look at the rumbling construction, cameras swung, reporters shouted questions, and residents began to whisper. The optics were perfect. Her kingdom was unraveling. and the public was witnessing every thread fall. And so, the second act of this long, heated standoff came to a close not with a bang, but with the hum of bulldozers and the deafening silence of a community losing faith in their so-called leaders. But the war wasn't over, because Marla had one last card to play, and in part 3, we'll find out just how far a woman drunk on power is willing to go when her empire is crumbling beneath her. Sheriff's schemes in a last stand. When you push someone with no power too far, they crumble. But when you push someone with too much power and they start to lose it, they become dangerous. Marla Henderson had spent years cultivating control, micromanaging lives like they were chess pieces, and ruling Pebblebrook's manicured lawns with the kind of smug authority reserved for small-time tyrants. But now, with her HOA board fractured, her name smeared across online forums and local news, and her prized community park stolen out from under her by the very man she tried to crush, she was coming unhinged. I could see it in her eyes the day she drove out to my ranch uninvited, hair a mess, makeup smeared by sweat and pride, her luxury SUV kicking up more dust than dignity. She didn't knock this time. She didn't yell. She just stood at the gate, clutching her phone like it was the last weapon in her arsenal. "You think you've won," she said quietly, her voice shaking not with fear but with restrained venom. "But you have no idea what you've started." I didn't respond. I just stared at her until she turned, stepped into her car, and drove off without another word. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The next morning, the consequences of that promise arrived on my porch in the form of a county citation, a stack of documents in a plastic sleeve, and a confused deputy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. According to the report, someone, an anonymous source, though we both knew who, had filed an extensive complaint alleging zoning violations, unlawful use of agricultural land for public entertainment, unlicensed food preparation, improper business, signage, illegal grading of protected earth, and my personal favorite, environmental sabotage through intentional lake drainage. It was legal spam, a blizzard of fake accusations tied up in enough bureaucratic red tape to cause a real problem. Not because any of it was true, but because the county had to investigate every single claim. I could see it in the deputy's face. He didn't want to be here, but he had to be. "Mr. Grant," he said politely, eyes scanning the forms. "You know how this works. We'll walk through, take a look, and I'll file what I have to. This kind of thing's unusual." I offered him coffee, and we spent the next hour walking the property: horses, fences, BBQ pit, tractor path, water lines. The bulldozer clearing Freedom Field paused as we passed. The deputy made a few notes, asked a few half-hearted questions, then handed me his card and said, "Off the record, this is a hit job. You didn't do anything wrong, but someone really doesn't like you." It was funny how fast Marla's facade of civility had unraveled. She wasn't fighting through policy anymore. She was using the county as a weapon. But I knew how to fight back, not just with land, but with truth. Remember Kevin, the ex-treasurer? He wasn't done helping. In fact, after seeing the firestorm Marla had kicked off, he doubled down. He met with county officials, shared proof of HOA funds being used for personal renovations on Marla's home, shared email chains where Marla explicitly stated she was building a wall of legal tape to entangle anyone who dared defy her. He even gave them an audio clip of her saying, "If the sheriff won't handle it, maybe the zoning office will." Choke him slow. It was enough to trigger an ethics review, not on me, but on her. And while the county dragged their feet with inspections on my end, an investigation had been opened on hers. Then came the breaking point, Marla's last desperate act. The HOA called for an emergency community vote. At first, it looked like a leadership election or bylaw amendment, but hidden on page 4 of the memo was the real goal: an emergency budget appropriation to buy back the park from me using HOA reserve funds. And get this, to file eminent domain if I refused to sell. It was delusional, illegal, wildly unconstitutional. But to the residents of Pebblebrook, many of whom didn't read the fine print or even fully understand what was happening, it was just another boring vote email with words like improvements, community enhancement, and park revitalization. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday. I had 72 hours to act, That night, I sat with my closest allies in the ranch house kitchen: Kevin, Ellie, Daniel, and a few brave neighbors who had long since stopped hiding. We brewed coffee, spread documents across the dining table, and strategized. Like generals, what we needed wasn't more land. We didn't need another press story. What we needed was to pull the curtain back completely, to show the Pebblebrook community who Marla really was. Live. So we did what every HOA dictator fears most: we went digital. Kevin's daughter was a whiz with technology. She set up a live stream disguised as a neighborhood Q&A for the emergency HOA meeting. We posted flyers, texted links, and handed out QR codes. When the meeting began Thursday evening in the Pebblebrook clubhouse, Marla looked confident again, hair neat, clipboard in hand, voice calm, lips curled in that smug half-smile she wore like a badge. She started with a speech about restoring balance and correcting the direction of the community. But then came the questions from residents in the room and from hundreds watching online. Why did you fine Miss Ellie for delivering pie? Why are HOA dues increasing while our park access is being shut down? Why was Tyler Grant accused of sabotage with zero evidence? Why did the HOA spend $17.00 on landscaping that never happened? Why did you tell a board member you would choke him slow with the zoning office? Marla's smile faded. Her hands trembled slightly. The questions kept coming. Kevin stood up and calmly listed every misuse of funds he had documented. A father pulled out his phone and played a voicemail from a board member threatening his daughter's swim team registration if he kept fraternizing with ranch people. It wasn't a Q&A anymore. It was a public reckoning. And then the sheriff walked in. He didn't say a word, just nodded to me in the back of the room, then handed Marla an envelope. Her hands froze as she read it. Inside was a formal notice: pending charges for financial misconduct, civil harassment, and falsification of zoning reports. She wasn't arrested, not yet, but the room went silent. Her power dissolved in real time. She didn't speak again, didn't finish the meeting. She just turned and left quietly, as if her shoes no longer clicked the way they used to. The following week, the HOA board dissolved itself. Marla resigned under pressure. The community filed to transition into a voluntary association. Residents held a neighborhood potluck. For the first time, they invited me, Tyler Grant, the rancher they were told to fear. I brought brisket, of course. The park, I kept it. But I reopened it with one condition: no HOA rules within its gates, no clipboards, no fines, just laughter, music, kids running free. I renamed it Second Chance Park, and Miss Ellie, she cut the ribbon. The courtroom where empires die for a moment, it seemed over. The HOA had collapsed. The community turned against its former tyrant, and the park, the symbol of control, greed, and resistance, now stood as a monument to free will and neighborly redemption. But power-hungry people like Marla Henderson don't disappear quietly. They don't retreat into silence or accept defeat with grace. They wait, stew, scheme in the dark like a wounded animal circling the firelight. And less than a month after she vanished from the neighborhood, I received a letter from her attorney. Not from the HOA, those days were over, but from her. Personally, the envelope was thick, filled with legal jargon, citations, and her signature at the bottom of each printed accusation. Marla had filed a civil lawsuit not against the board, not against the community, but against me. The charges: defamation, intentional interference with HOA operations, loss of income, and emotional distress. She even had the audacity to include a handwritten note: "You humiliated me. Now you'll understand consequences." To say I was stunned would be a lie. I had known it would come, just not like this. Not in the form of such carefully tailored venom. She was no longer using her fake badge of authority. She was now weaponizing the court system itself. My first reaction was instinctive, anger. But I didn't let it control me. I walked through my pasture for nearly an hour that day, letting the sun hit my shoulders, the dust cling to my boots, the wind whisper against the barbed wire fences that framed my land. I thought of my grandfather, who fought off land developers with nothing but pocket change and stubbornness. I thought of my father, who worked his hands bloody to keep the ranch running through drought. And I thought of Miss Ellie, who once told me, "Sometimes you don't fight fire with fire, Tyler. Sometimes you bring water and flood em out completely. I called Mark, my lawyer, and handed him the documents. He read through them, eyebrows rising slightly at the sheer absurdity of it all. You're going to want to fight this in public, he said. She's not just trying to sue you, she's trying to shame you back into silence. But here's the thing about me, I don't play defense. Not when I'm right. Not when my name's being dragged through the mud by someone who tried to destroy a community. Just because she couldn't own it, we didn't countersue, not yet. We didn't hold press conferences or drop social media bombs. What we did was simple, methodical, and devastatingly precise. We gathered everything. Mark sent subpoenas for Marla's personal financial records. We requested HOA communications, even during her so-called resignation phase. We compiled every witness, every digital file, every conversation that had been recorded in the fallout of her collapse. And while she had filed in civil court hoping to play victim, our counterarguments told a very different story. Her suit claimed emotional trauma, but we had evidence she had stalked and harassed residents, falsified zoning complaints, manipulated ballots, and attempted to initiate an illegal land grab using community funds without proper approval. And then came the silver bullet. Kevin unearthed a deleted audio file, buried in a backup folder on his old computer. In it, Marla could be heard coaching a subordinate on how to stage just enough violations to pressure people out of their homes. People don't fight tickets, she said, laughing. They just pay and shut up. That's how we keep them quiet. The court date was set for early fall. A crisp morning, leaves just starting to turn. The kind of day that makes you believe justice can breathe again. We didn't enter the courthouse as victims. We walked in as truth bearers. Myself, Mark, Kevin, Daniel, Miss Ellie, and 3 other residents who volunteered to testify. Marla sat across the aisle in a pale gray suit, lips pursed, eyes hollow. She wasn't the HOA queen anymore. She was a defendant pretending to be a plaintiff. Her opening argument was theatrical, as expected. Her attorney painted her as a woman maligned by coordinated social humiliation, a volunteer civil servant brought low by false narratives and organized character assassination. She wiped tears at all the right moments. Her lawyer pointed to screenshots of tweets, YouTube videos, and neighborhood blog posts as examples of emotional terrorism. And when he called her to the stand, she gave a performance worthy of an awards show, complete with trembling hands and long stares into the gallery. That it was our turn. Mark started slow, respectful. He didn't challenge her emotion, he challenged her memory. He walked her through a timeline she didn't want to revisit. Dates, names, meetings, audio clips. Her answers grew clipped, defensive. Then came the bombshell evidence, audio recordings. Not dramatized, not taken out of context, just truth, raw and untouched. Her voice, her laughter, her planning. The courtroom shifted with every sentence. Jurors sat straighter. Even the judge, a normally expressionless man in his 60s, leaned forward and scribbled more actively. And then Mark made a bold move. He called Miss Ellie to the stand. She stood slowly, dressed in a pressed lavender blouse and holding a small notebook in trembling fingers. "Your Honor," she said gently, "I've lived through wars, recessions, and widowed winters. But I've never felt as unwelcome in my own neighborhood as I did when I was punished for kindness." Her voice never rose, never quivered. But when she finished, the silence in that courtroom was heavier than steel. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. It felt like 60. When they returned, I didn't know what to expect, but I didn't need to. The moment the foreman read the verdict, "We find in favor of the defendant, Mr. Tyler Grant, and award no damages to the plaintiff," I knew everything we fought for had been worth it. The judge even admonished Marla, noting that her lawsuit appeared to be retaliatory in nature and lacking in credible merit, which opened the door for sanctions against her. Mark leaned over and whispered, "Now we play offense." We filed a civil countersuit immediately for defamation, harassment, legal abuse, and financial damages. And this time, we didn't just win. We crushed it. The court awarded me enough to cover every dollar I spent in this battle and enough to build something new on my land, a center, not a park, not a protest, but a gathering place called the Commons, free from HOA rules, a space for barbecues, story circles, live music, stargazing, and town hall talks, a sanctuary for neighbors, a monument to standing your ground. Marla vanished after the second verdict. Rumors swirled she moved states, changed her name, refused interviews. But honestly, I didn't care. She was part of a past we had already buried beneath new roots. Because this story wasn't about one petty tyrant, it was about the spirit that rose up to challenge her. And what happens when a man says no, not just for himself, but for everyone too afraid to speak? They wanted my land again, but I owned the map. Victory, as it turns out, isn't always the end, it's the beginning of a new battlefield. After the lawsuits ended and Marla's shadow finally slipped beneath the horizon, the town took a breath. The tension in Pebblebrook cracked like a shell under sunlight. Neighbors who once peered through blinds now met on sidewalks, offering cautious waves and warm pies. Children rode their bikes again, without the constant threat of being fined for unsafe activity. Miss Ellie returned to her garden club. Daniel's kids rejoined their swim team. And as for me, I poured my energy into the commons, the community. Gathering space I built with court-awarded damages and a little rancher ingenuity. A converted barn served as the main hall. Oak trees from my great-grandfather's grove were planted around the perimeter. We installed picnic benches, a fire pit, a community kitchen, and even a modest open-air stage. Every Saturday, people gathered not just from Pebblebrook, but from nearby towns, grilling, storytelling, laughing under the stars. For a while, peace reigned. But peace, I've learned, never sits still too long in places where power once lived. It began subtly. Flyers appeared around Pebblebrook with smiling faces and bold fonts. Let's rebuild our community with your voice. It looked innocent, motivational, inclusive. But buried beneath the slogans was something else, familiar language about standards, restoring harmony, and new leadership for a better tomorrow. At the bottom of each flyer were the names of 5 individuals, new residents, mostly a real estate developer, a former HOA consultant, a corporate executive's wife, a landscaping business owner, and an ex-police officer. These weren't just people looking to help, they were people looking to govern. They weren't trying to resurrect the old HOA. No, they were smarter than that. They proposed something called a Community Advisory Council, a non-binding body that would make recommendations and help guide decisions. They promised no fines, no enforcement, no mandatory dues, just a little structure to help keep things neighborly. It all sounded reasonable, too reasonable. And it wasn't long before I realized that what they were really building was HOA 2.0, a snake in a new skin. Within 2 months, they held meetings, published pamphlets, and convinced over 60% of Pebblebrook households to sign a non-binding charter. They branded themselves as the voice of Pebblebrook. They even reached out to me, requesting collaboration between the Commons and their new council. I declined, politely, firmly. And that's when the real goal came out. One rainy morning, I received a packet at the gate. Inside was a formal request on embossed letterhead from the Advisory Council. They wanted to propose the reacquisition and redevelopment of the Commons land for what they described as community-enhancing multi-use purposes. In other words, they wanted my land, the land they once tried to find me over, sue me for, and sabotage through zoning warfare back in there. Hence, they offered a buyout, citing future potential, economic uplift, and shared progress. The amount was generous, too generous. It reeked of outside funding, of someone pouring money into the council with promises of returns once. They converted my land into a real estate project, a recreational complex, or worse, a new HOA headquarters. But money never moved me. Principle did. I didn't respond to the offer. I didn't need to. My silence was the only answer they were going to get. That should have been the end of it. But people driven by control don't take no with grace. They treat it like a dare. The council doubled down. They began pushing propaganda. Whisper campaigns started around the town. Rumors spread that I was hoarding land, limiting access, standing in the way of Pebblebrook's growth. They called the Commons an unregulated liability. They claimed my public gatherings created risk. I saw through it all. They weren't just trying to convince others I was the target. Again. But this time, I was ready in ways they couldn't have imagined. You see, while they were rebranding bureaucracy, I'd been building more than just fire pits and picnic tables. I had spent months quietly working with legal advisors and property planners. I filed to turn the commons into a protected historical site and a public charitable trust, an irrevocable one. That meant it couldn't be sold, subdivided, or repurposed. The land would belong to the trust, operated independently of any local board or municipality, with myself as founding director and a rotating group of trustees chosen by the community, not bureaucrats. But that wasn't the only move I made. I also bought the buffer lands, the odd, narrow strips between Pebblebrook's outer homes and the border of my property. Previously unclaimed, most were sloped or filled with scrub brush, but now they served a new purpose, a protective greenbelt. I created a wildlife reserve there, registered, state recognized, fully protected. Now, not only was my main land shielded from acquisition, but a ring of nature legally stood between their ambitions and my reality. So when they came to me again, this time with lawyers and PR teams in tow, demanding a negotiation over shared stewardship of future zones, I handed them the paperwork and let them read every page of the unbreakable wall I had built. And then, for good measure, I handed them a jar of Miss Ellie's peach preserves with a note that read, "Here's something you can actually preserve." That was the moment their new empire crumbled before it ever truly began. But the best part, it wasn't just my victory this time. It was the people's. In the weeks that followed, dozens of Pebblebrook residents, who had been cautiously observing from the sidelines, began showing up at the commons. They offered support, apologies, unity. One by one, they told me they'd been fooled by the fancy flyers and buzzwords, but they were done with being manipulated. Miss Ellie taught a baking class under the pavilion. Kevin gave his first free community finance workshop. Daniel's kids performed a small theater skit on the stage. The commons didn't just survive, it thrived. And the council, they disbanded. Without ceremony, no meetings, no votes, no farewell. Just a quiet fizzle in the shadow of something more powerful than authority trust. Because you can buy influence, you can build structures, you can throw around fancy titles and print high-end pamphlets, but you can't fake roots, you can't fake sincerity, and you can't buy the heart of a town that's finally learned to beat on its own. The truth she tried to bury seasons past. The commons became more than just a piece of land, it was a living symbol of what could be built when people stood together rather than under someone. Children grew up learning how to ride horses near the fire pit. Veterans shared war stories beside traveling musicians. The land became sacred not because of what it cost, but because of what it had cost us to protect. Pebblebrook changed too. The scars of Marla's regime faded, replaced by block parties, clean fences, and a kind of cautious optimism. Even those who had once been silent started to speak up, not in fear, but in freedom. And yet, despite all the growth, one ghost remained, Marla. Her name no longer passed lips in town. Her legacy scrubbed from the HOA files, her face erased from public memory, but I never fully believed we'd seen the last of her. Not because I expected another attack, but because people like her don't vanish, they wait. They hide behind doors, and sometimes they leave behind things more dangerous than themselves. It was on a chilly November morning, when frost curled along the fence posts and the air smelled like burning mesquite, that she finally returned, or rather, someone returned for her. A woman, middle-aged, small-framed but tightly composed, arrived at the edge of the commons wearing a gray wool coat and sunglasses. I noticed her only because she lingered by the memorial plaque we'd placed near the old oak, the one with names of every community member who stood up during the HOA battles. She stared at it for almost 10 minutes before walking toward me, clutching a thin leather satchel in one hand and something clenched tightly in the other. "You're Tyler Grant," she said plainly. Not a question, just a statement packed with tension. "Yes," I replied cautiously. She removed her sunglasses and extended her hand. "My name is Isabel Hart. I'm Marla's sister." I didn't answer. I simply gestured toward a bench near the edge of the field, where we could sit beneath the wide sky. Whatever brought her here, it wasn't to rekindle flames. It was the look in her eyes that told me she wasn't here to protect Marla's name. She was here to bury it, for the next 2 hours. Isabel unraveled a story that neither I nor anyone in Pebblebrook could have ever imagined. She began with their childhood raised by a military father and a mother who believed in perfection. More than affection, Marla had always been the golden child, the rule follower, the enforcer. But underneath, Isabel said, she was driven by a desperation to control something, anything, because she'd never been able to control her own life. After college, Marla fell into property management, where she quickly rose by enforcing policy with a kind of zealotry that made her feared and admired. She bounced through several HOA letters, leaving a trail of resentment behind her each time. Pebblebrook, Isabel said, was supposed to be her clean slate, a place she could finally make perfect. But here's where the story turned darker than I expected. Isabel handed me a folder, documents, letters, medical records. It revealed that just months before Marla arrived in Pebblebrook, she had been diagnosed with a neurological condition, early onset frontotemporal dementia, a rare, aggressive form. The doctor's notes were clear: increased paranoia, aggression, obsessive behavior, and impaired judgment were all symptomatic. The signs were there: the erratic enforcement, the obsession with control, the emotional outbursts, the complete detachment from reality as her HOA reign collapsed. It wasn't just cruelty, it was mental deterioration. I sat in silence as the weight of this revelation sank in. I thought of all the sleepless nights, the threats, the courtroom battles, the bruised spirits in Pebblebrook, and for the first time, I didn't feel anger toward Marla. I felt pity, not because she deserved forgiveness, but because she'd never gotten help. She had been left alone, swallowed by a disease that weaponized her worst instincts and left her thinking she was right all along. I tried to intervene, Isabel said quietly, but she pushed me away. And once she found Pebblebrook, she didn't want help, she wanted legacy. I asked where Marla was now. Isabel said she was in a private care facility several states away, nonverbal, barely responsive. Her lawyers were gone. Her property had been sold. The woman who once ruled over a pristine HOA kingdom now sat in silence, a prisoner of her own mind. Isabel hadn't come for pity or redemption or to soften the truth. She came because she didn't want Pebblebrook to keep carrying a story without the full ending. She did terrible things, she said, but I don't want her to be remembered only for her cruelty. I want her to be remembered as someone who needed help and never got it. After she left, I walked the commons alone. I stood beneath the oak tree, where a new plaque had just been installed. It read, "Built by the people, protected by truth, open to all." I thought about Marla, not the tyrant, but the woman who sat in that quiet room far away. I thought about the people who suffered under her hand and the others who blindly followed her. And I realized something. Even in her final absence, she had left behind a lesson greater than all the rules she'd ever written. That power without empathy is poison. That order without understanding breeds rebellion. That control without community always collapses. So I did something I never thought I would. I added a final name to the memorial plaque, small, at the very bottom, away from the others. Just one word, Marla. Not to celebrate her, not to forgive her, but to complete the truth. Because this land, this town, this fight, it wasn't just about defeating her. It was about surviving her. And no story of survival is complete without the shadow we outlived. Asterisk.